In the heart of classical Athens, a city renowned for its intellectual flowering and democratic ideals, existed a brutal contradiction. A deeply entrenched system of slavery that included women subjected to violence, control, and public degradation. What did it mean to be a doul, a female slave, in a society that worshipped liberty for citizens but bound others in chains? Slavery in ancient Greece did not emerge from a singular event, but from a centuries-long pattern of conquest, trade, and social stratification. By the 5th century BCE, Athens was a slave society in every economic and institutional sense. Female slaves, known in legal terms as douli, came primarily through warfare, piracy, and slave markets. They were typically non-Greeks, seized from Thrace, Phrygia, Lydia, or regions around the Black Sea. Many were children or young women, torn from their families, their identities reduced to transactional value. While male slaves might work in agriculture, mines, or as household servants, female slaves often faced far more invasive roles. They were employed as domestic workers, wet nurses, attendants, or laborers in state-run establishments like textile workshops. Their bodies were not simply tools of labor, but commodities of control. In the Oeconomicus, Xenophon describes the expected obedience of female slaves, emphasizing the owner's power to train them like animals, a concept as dehumanizing as it was systemic. Marriage offered no protection. Female slaves were legally incapable of marriage. Any union they formed had no standing under Athenian law. Their children, whether born of another slave or their master, were not recognized as citizens. They belonged not to themselves, but to the household, the oikos, under the authority of the kyrios, the male master. Punishment was a constant threat. Greek law did not protect enslaved women from physical violence. Indeed, violence was the enforcement mechanism of the institution. A female slave could be punished for speaking out of turn, for failing at a task, or for resisting unwanted control. And yet, the severity of this oppression was normalized, embedded in the legal codes, the social customs, and even the economic writings of the time. In the Athenian courtrooms, a female slave's testimony could only be accepted under torture. This was not a mere procedural quirk. It reflected a legal system that presumed slaves could not speak truth unless under pain, as their voices were considered inherently unreliable unless wrenched from them by suffering. Thus began a life defined by others' will, foreign in blood, owned in body, and silenced by law. Whipping supervised in civic spaces of Athens. Athenian democracy prided itself on isonomia, equality before the law, but only for free male citizens. For the enslaved, especially women, the same civic spaces that hosted philosophical debates and political assemblies could also become arenas of public punishment. Whipping, a punishment not hidden but supervised within view of the polis, reinforced both control and humiliation. It was not merely disciplinary, it was demonstrative. Enslaved women were routinely beaten for disobedience, failed tasks, or perceived insolence, often under the direct supervision of a household overseer or paidagogos. But there were instances when the punishment was administered in public civic zones, near the agora, along the Eridanos river banks, or adjacent to the workshops where slaves labored under state contracts. These spaces were not neutral. They were symbols of Athenian power, and by staging punishments there, masters reminded both slave and spectator of the rigid boundaries of status. The procedure could be brutal, but regulated. For example, in legal cases where a female slave's testimony was required, the court could order torture as standard protocol, and that included flogging under supervision. In Demosthenes against Ontor, the speaker notes a situation involving a slave woman whose testimony required confirmation through physical coercion, a clear reflection of how intertwined legal and violent control were. Enslaved women working in state-regulated public establishments, a system organized under Solonian reforms, faced even more exposure. The whip itself, typically a leather strap, mastix, was both a weapon and a symbol. It appeared in vase paintings, held by slave masters or guards, silently conveying its everyday presence in the lives of the enslaved. Such punishments were meant to dehumanize through exposure. Whipping in civic view did not elicit sympathy. It reinforced the social order in which pain affirmed ownership. The fact that a punishment could be supervised in the open and yet attract no legal reprisal or moral outcry reflects how fully accepted the institution of slavery was in the democratic heart of Athens. In these acts, the Athenians laid bare a contradiction. The same society that birthed the concept of political liberty also legitimized the public torment of those it refused to see as human. Marking with heated bronze tools in Athens. To be enslaved in ancient Athens was to live under the constant threat of bodily violation, but for many female slaves, that threat materialized in the form of permanent branding. The use of heated bronze tools to mark slaves, particularly women, was not merely punitive. It was an institutional act of dehumanization, a permanent reminder of status, burned into flesh. Branding in Athens, while not universal, was widely practiced in contexts where control and identification were prioritized. Female slaves who worked in bathhouses, regulated quarters, or state-supervised establishments were particularly vulnerable. When forced into regulated service, these women were often marked with heated iron or bronze, a practice referenced obliquely in comedic plays and confirmed through literary and legal sources that described their marked condition. The location of the brand varied, but in many cases it was placed on the forehead, ensuring that no clothing could conceal it. This made reintegration into free society impossible. The mark itself might indicate ownership, profession, or simply the status of enslavement. The tools used, bronze rods, iron stamps, were likely heated in open flame. The process was agonizing. There are no surviving first-hand accounts from enslaved women, as their voices were excluded from the written record, but the legal silence surrounding the practice speaks volumes. In addition to identification, branding served as deterrent. A runaway slave marked by bronze could be immediately recognized and returned or punished further. The politai, Athenian officials responsible for market regulation, were known to inspect enslaved people for such marks during transactions. The branded body was thus not only owned, it was certified, like livestock. The Athenians saw these marks not as cruelty, but as administrative necessity. Yet each seared symbol testified to a deeper reality, that in a city that sculpted ideals in marble, it also burned its hierarchies into human skin. Assigned endless household tasks with no legal rights. For countless enslaved women in Athens, the walls of the household, the oikos, were both workplace and prison. Unlike male slaves who might toil in fields, workshops or quarries, many female slaves were bound to domestic service, a life defined by exhausting repetition and constant vulnerability. Their days began before sunrise and stretched into the night, filled with endless tasks that demanded their bodies, their attention, and often their silence. The duties were relentless. Cooking meals over smoky hearths, grinding grain into flour, carrying heavy water jars from fountains, weaving at looms until their fingers blistered, cleaning floors, tending children not their own, nursing infants, and caring for the sick or elderly. Every aspect of household labor fell upon them, with no reprieve or recognition. Xenophon's Oeconomicus provides an unsettlingly matter-of-fact description of such roles, explaining how the master should train women slaves to manage provisions, spin, and keep order, just as he would instruct animals for labor. But these tasks were not merely burdensome. They were accompanied by constant surveillance and the threat of violence. Female slaves could be beaten for failing to meet the expectations of their mistresses or masters. They might endure verbal reprimands for the smallest mistake, or more severe physical discipline if their work was deemed unsatisfactory. The very intimacy of household life, working in kitchens, bedrooms, and nurseries, meant they were exposed to mistreatment not only as servants but as women. Exploitation, especially personal, was a risk they lived with daily, especially in smaller households where boundaries between labor and mistreatment could dissolve completely. Isolation deepened their suffering. Confined within domestic walls, these women had little contact with others beyond their masters and fellow servants. In tragedy, their voices sometimes break through, as when Euripides portrays enslaved women lamenting their endless toil, fragments of truth filtered through drama. Thus, while Athens celebrated public life in the agora, the home itself became a hidden site of ceaseless exploitation. For female slaves, it was not only the weight of labor that defined existence, but also the constant shadow of mistreatment that accompanied their every task. The story of female slaves in Athens exposes the deep fracture at the heart of a society that proclaimed liberty yet enforced bondage with whip, brand, and endless labor. Their suffering was woven into the fabric of the household and displayed in the civic square, a silent foundation upon which the freedoms of citizens rested. These women's bodies bore the weight of punishment, mistreatment, and invisibility, yet their presence shaped the city as much as its philosophers or statesmen. How should we interpret the legacy of a democracy that thrived only by denying humanity to others? Comment below. As Aristotle himself admitted, slavery was viewed as a possession of the animate sort.